All right, the next topics that we are going to discuss are going to be the polio virus and the Ebola virus. The two have very different modes of transmission, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in terms of that, they're going to have very different treatments. The polio virus is what we'll focus on first. All right, the polio virus has what's known as a fecal-oral transmission, meaning fecal matter ends up in the oral cavity or the digestive system. And in terms of that, with the fecal-oral transmission, this is the one that kind of makes you want to go ooh. Because when you think about how that happens, it's a little bit gross. But typically when we're talking about viruses, you don't need a lot of viral particles in order to have and pass on a disease like polio, okay? So in terms of that, typically any type of virus that goes by a fecal-oral transmission is a result, really, of poor hand washing, all right? And where this might be a bit more relevant is going to be in places nowadays like daycares, all right? Because another type of virus that has the fecal-oral transmission are rotaviruses, all right? And if you have kids, you know that that rotavirus really kind of goes through the daycare really quickly, all right? One kid gets sick and then eventually everybody else does, all right? What it gets down to is poor hand washing. You'll either get, the kid end up getting into their diapers, they get fecal matter on their hands, they'll put it in their mouth, or they get fecal matter on their hands, they go play with toys. Another kid picks up that same toy, puts it in their mouth. That's how you end up with fecal-oral transmission, all right? So in terms of that, a lot of these types of viruses, propagation of them can be reduced by really good hand washing, all right? But in terms of the polio virus infection itself, okay, the polio virus it's excreted in the feces, all right? And that's going to be how it spreads, all right? But what happens when the polio virus enters the intestinal system, all right? It'll be passed on through the feces. Where polio ends up resulting in the disease process is going to be if that polio virus moves into the nervous system, okay? Because there are people who do and are exposed to the polio virus. That virus goes through their system. They kind of have some intestinal issues that happen. The polio virus is excreted in their feces, but they don't end up with polio, all right? The folks who end up with polio, the difference is that virus particle leaves the intestinal system. It jumps into the nervous system, all right? And in terms of the polio virus, specifically what we're talking about impacting are going to be motor nerves, okay? And those motor nerves, all right, what ends up happening, the polio virus destroys those motor nerves. That's what results in paralysis with the polio virus, okay? The motor nerves in the spinal column get destroyed and you've got paralysis. Now, where in the spinal column that virus hits is going to be what dictates the amount of paralysis that the person has. If it's lower in the spinal column, the paralysis is going to be contained to the lower body. If it's higher, you're going to get, paralysis of upper limbs, the arms. And in terms of that, it can also hit and interfere with the diaphragm, all right? If it interferes with the diaphragm, that person is no longer able to breathe on their own, all right? That's where that poliovirus can become fatal, all right? Now what we've got with the poliovirus in terms of treatment is going to be a vaccine, all right? Most of you probably had a polio vaccination when you were little. In terms of that, the polio vaccine has cut the incidence of polio in the population here in the United States to just about 0, all right? What we're starting to see now is the incidence of polio that's occurring in the population in the United States is actually coming from the polio vaccine itself, all right? And that can happen with some live attenuated vaccines. It can end up causing the disease you're trying to prevent. But that happens in a very, very small percentage of the population. And in terms of that, there's a greater risk of having polio continue in the population than there is of that one person who ends up with polio because of a vaccine, all right? So in terms of that, vaccinations have cut polio down to about nothing as far as incidence here in the United States, all right? So that vaccination works, all right? So that's what we're going to go for our polio virus, all right? The other virus that we're going to discuss here is going to be Ebola, all right? Ebola is a hemorrhagic virus. Hemorrhagic, what it ends up doing is it causes essentially the blood vessels to start breaking apart and the blood starts leaking out of the person. They'll start, you'll see it in their tears, in their secretions, in their saliva, in their urine. It breaks down vessels and essentially the person kind of ends up bleeding to death, all right? It's not very pleasant. And in terms of transmission, within the human population, now this is where there's going to be a distinction, all right? Transmission in the human population is going to be with blood or blood products, urine, very late in disease. It's going to be saliva or sweat, all right? But in terms of that, the amount of viral particles have to be really, really high in order to get transmission via saliva or sweat, all right? Now, that's what we're talking about with transmission. The other thing with the Ebola virus is somewhere out there, there is a vector or host that allows it to propagate. This is the part with the Ebola virus that we don't know, all right? It's proposed that it may be bats. I've seen monkeys, all right? They may be surviving in insects. Essentially, the vector there, what we're talking about with the vector, that particular organism is infected with the Ebola virus, but it doesn't make them sick. Then what happens is a person comes in contact with whatever that vector is, the virus is transferred to humans, and then it becomes very contagious among the human population. And that's where the transmission via blood and urine can happen with the Ebola virus, okay? So that vector or the reservoir where the virus lives, we still don't know yet. That's still up for research, okay? So in terms of that, I want you to be able to make that distinction. We're talking about transmission within the human population here, not transmission necessarily from the reservoir to a person. We're talking person to person. So this is going to be bloodborne, and this is going to be my example of a virus that's transmitted via a bloodborne mechanism, okay? And in terms of Ebola, all right, the downside on Ebola There's no real treatment available for Ebola, all right? You either live or you die, all right? And in terms of that, one thing that can impact living over dying seems to be hydration. Those people who seek medical care sooner, get on IVs, stay very well hydrated, have a higher likelihood of surviving the Ebola virus than someone who doesn't, okay? And in terms of that, that's in part why the Ebola virus is so devastating in Africa, is because they don't necessarily have, in the communities where this is coming up, safe water sources that will allow that to happen. They also don't have the medical resources that we have here in the United States, okay? So in terms of that, with the Ebola virus, this came up in the news a couple of years ago. And people here in the United States were really scared that they were going to end up with the Ebola virus. Likelihood of getting the Ebola virus here in the United States, very, very slim, okay? Really what you want to be more concerned with here in New Mexico, it's not a virus per se, but you have a greater likelihood of contracting the bubonic plague here, which is bacterial, or tularemia, all right? Because both of those exist here in New Mexico, so you may see cases of those. If you stay here in New Mexico, you're never going to see a case of Ebola, all right? And in terms of that, we here in New Mexico really don't have the medical facilities to treat Ebola. There are only a few facilities nationwide that are able to do that. The NIH is going to be one of them, okay? So in terms of that, with Ebola virus, transmissions via blood products, poliovirus, it's fecal oral transmission. If you have any questions, please let me know.